In the 1930s, the worst environmental catastrophe in American history ripped through the heartland, turning farms into dust-covered deserts. As the rain stopped, the relentless winds carried off the topsoil, sending it off in huge dirt clouds that turned blue skies black. This decade-long disaster took place smack in the middle of the worst economic depression in history, which only compounded the farmers' problems. But what caused such rich farmlands, America's breadbasket, to be left in dust and ruin? And how did millions of Americans respond when it seemed that the land and the country had deserted them? Well, that's the treasure we're out to discover. I'm Dan Luer, and this is History for Humans. So our exploration question for today that you should be focused on is, how did the Dust Bowl impact Americans living through it, and how did it transform the nation? So keep your mind focused on that, but first we gotta blow the dust off of some history and head back to the past. One of the most beautiful and iconic landscapes across North America is the Great Plains. It is a broad expanse of dry flatlands, home to rich green prairie grasses that seem to stretch on forever. Those native grasses had evolved over millions of years to survive in the region, with roots up to 12 feet long to retain moisture in the soil and hold it in place against the relentless winds. And until the Civil War, most Americans believed the area was far too dry to settle and to farm. But after the Civil War, the American government began to encourage settlement in the region. The Homestead Act granted settlers 160 acres for a small fee if they lived and farmed on the land. And then millions headed out west with the aid of the Transcontinental Railroad. Acre by acre was put under the plow. The grasses uprooted and replaced with cattle ranches, corn, but most of all, wheat. Advertisements heralded the Plains region of Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, Texas, and Nebraska as an agricultural gold mine. In the early 1900s, the price of wheat was rising and it spiked during World War I. More and more Americans were claiming homesteads in the region, despite it only receiving about 20 inches of rain a year, and often less. Nature be damned, the guiding mantra of the times was that rain will follow the plow. That once the region was put to use for agriculture, the weather would accommodate itself to the likings of the farmers. It was American optimism married to American determination, albeit a foolish and reckless determination. But then in the mid-1920s, the price of wheat fell. Farmers responded by digging up more acres and planting more wheat. The problem was that increasing harvests only lowered the prices further, driving hard-working farm families further into debt and despair. And after years of hard times, a crash on the stock market was about to send the rest of the nation into hard times of their own. The Great Depression was caused by many things, as we learned about last episode, but it was triggered and catapulted by the stock market crash. As billions of dollars were lost, as banks failed, as businesses and industries went under, and workers lost their jobs, the economy contracted into the worst economic depression in American history. The Great Depression left millions of Americans without work, food, and perhaps worst of all, hope. President Herbert Hoover was reluctant to take action. Though he was deeply concerned about the hardships suffered by Americans, his sympathy was not seen, but his inaction was deeply felt. Hooverville was the name given to the shanty towns popping up across the nation as the people blamed the president for the country's problems. And that brings us to Dad Jokes in History! What do you call the finest establishment in a Depression-era shantytown? A Hoover Villa. Hoover Villa. You're welcome for that, and if you think you got an even better knee slapper than that that's related to this video, let's see it in the comment section below. And the Depression sank deeper and deeper year after year. The unemployment rate hit 25%, but still Hoover clung to orthodox beliefs that it was not the government's role to intervene. Hoover was guided by the belief in rugged individualism, that people needed to pick themselves up and that the government handouts would not only be costly, but it would create dependency on welfare. He believed that government handouts would also break the spirit of proud Americans. And while it's true that no one wanted a handout, jobless Americans were left with little to no other choices. And then in a very let them eat cake moment, Hoover said that what the nation really needed was a good laugh, and if a good joke could be cracked every week or so, it would get the nation out of the dark times that it was stuck in. Americans responded by hurling rotting vegetables at his train car and motorcade when he was campaigning in the 1932 election. Let him eat rotting cabbage was their response. And in that election, Hoover and his Republican Party were walloped by the charismatic appeal of Franklin Roosevelt and the Democrats, who promised a new deal to the American people. And his miraculous first 100 days in office that totally transformed the role of American government, that's the focus of our next episode, so make sure to tune in for that. But just as hope and a helping hand landed in the White House, the Plains farmers were just beginning to realize the magnitude of nature's wrath that was cast down upon them. Across what would become the Dust Bowl states of Oklahoma, North Texas, Colorado, Kansas, and Nebraska, the rains had slowed by 1930. By 1931, a drought had set in. Without the grasses to hold the soil, when high winds came, choking dust storms that would last nearly a decade began to sweep across the region. It became a disaster of biblical proportions, a plague of dust and dirt that would cause its own exodus. For religious people, it seemed to be a sign of the end times. Black blizzards engulfed the region, with dust and dirt tens of thousands of feet in the air, like giant moving mountains. The dust storms blotted out the sun, killed crops, livestock, and even people. Dust pneumonia affected tens of thousands of residents, leading to fevers, coughing, chest pains, and for some, death. Hundreds and potentially thousands died from it. In 1934, the Red Cross had declared a medical emergency. Masks and goggles were sent in from across the nation, and schools and churches were turned into hospitals to treat the people. Carolyn Henderson, having lived through the Dust Bowls, summed up the years like this: dust to eat and dust to breathe and dust to drink. Dust in the beds and in the flour bin, on dishes and walls and windows, in hair and eyes and ears and teeth and throats, to say nothing of the heaped up accumulation on floors and windowsills after one of the bad days. And the dust storms were not confined to the Plains region. They swept all across the country. On May 9, 1934, 350 million tons of dirt rose 2 miles high and slowly swept across the Midwest. 12 million tons blanketed the city of Chicago and later hit New York City. Streetlights were turned on at midday. Tourists coughed up dust in Central Park, and boat captains struggled to make out the Statue of Liberty from behind the dark clouds. Dust covered the White House just as President Roosevelt was holding a press conference to gain support for drought-ridden farmers. Across the Dust Bowl states, people struggled against the hardships to maintain their way of life and keep their dignity. In between storms, there were plenty of bright and beautifully blue days, and the people held out for the promise of rains and the prospect of next year's harvest, though it did not come. In schoolhouses, children and teachers read aside candlelight. Mothers did all they could to fortify their homes against the dust, and the farmers in the fields pumped what water they could to try to squeeze a profit from the barren lands, but to no avail. Unable to pay their mortgages or their debts, millions lost their homes and farms. Though most actually stayed in the region to weather the storm, over 2.5 million others headed out west in what became one of the largest migrations in American history. Most of them headed to California. But these migrants were not welcomed in an area that was suffering from economic problems of their own. The disdainful term Okies was used to ridicule and insult those that fled the Dust Bowl seeking a new life out west. Despite the continued hardships, they did their best to find work, to farm, and against the odds, held out hope for a richer tomorrow. It was this reckless optimism that had led them to sow their fortunes in such a dry and barren land to begin with, but it was that same reckless optimism that enabled them to bear the burdens that it brought and muscle ahead towards a better tomorrow. And finally, by 1939, regular rainfall returned. The Dust Bowl ended, but the economic and environmental damage would last for decades. 125 million acres of land had been stripped of their topsoil. But New Deal programs began to not only give relief to struggling farmers, but to combat the roots of the problem, namely that there were no roots holding in the soil. So the Soil Erosion Service was created, as were other programs to plant trees that would act as windbreakers and hold down the soil. By 1940, 40 million trees had been planted from government programs to protect the region. Farmers were taught and encouraged to implement techniques like crop rotation, terracing, and contour plowing. The Dust Bowl led to the federal government having a greater role in managing agriculture and the environment that it still carries on today. The story of the Dust Bowl is one of the resilience of the American people, and a lesson in not being so foolish as to strip nature of all of its wealth without actually caring for the land that we live and rely on. It's unfortunate that it sometimes takes catastrophe and calamity to teach us such lessons, but at least we can do that. So, thanks for engaging in history today. This has been History for Humans. Thanks so much to all of you for tuning in and learning with me today. I so do appreciate your support. And if you enjoyed it, could you go ahead and click the thumb that looks like this? And if you click on the subscribe button, you'll get updates on new episodes, which we're going to be dropping regularly. And if you go to my website, www.history4humans.com, you can join into forums and conversations with students around the country. And for teachers, there's a ton of free and some less than free resources that go with all of my videos. And if you're doing the learning activity, hang out because I got instructions in just a second. Get ready to dance with the dead, y'all. That's what you call it when you analyze primary sources, right? Those documents from the past? No? Well, that's what I call it. Anyway, in today's lesson, what you're going to be doing is analyzing a series of primary sources. Your big task is going to be to write a fictional but realistic letter that details your experiences as if you lived through the Dust Bowl and then traveled to California. To do that, you're going to analyze a couple of poems, some photography that's just dripping with rich history, and then read a secondary source as well. Each one is going to have you answer a couple of questions to get you ready and armed with a bunch of ammunition to write a powerful, dramatic, and rich letter that is filled with historical detail. I hope you get into this and really try to imagine what it was like for Americans living and struggling through these times. Okay, act like farmers on this one and plow through it.